And it was my pleasure to be able to extend an invitation to a very important friend and colleague of the American Folklore Society, Barbro Klein. Barbro Klein is one of those rare folklorists that we know in America who've really worked on both sides of the ocean in so many different ways. She's currently Director Emerita and Permanent Fellow. Permanent Fellow, that sounded something significant. I like that sense of permanence. She's Permanent Fellow of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study and Professor Emerita of Ethnology at Stockholm University. Barbro Klein received her PhD in folklore studies and anthropology, where else? At Indiana University. This is that kind of afternoon. In 1970, and is taught at the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Bergen, Stockholm University, and other institutions. She also serves or has served on the editorial boards of the Journal of American Folklore, the Journal of Folklore Research, Ethnologica Scandinavia, Journal of Northern Studies, and other periodicals. She has been a member of the executive board of the American Folklore Society and is currently a member of the board of Point Sud in Bamako. During 1997 to 2000, she co-directed a multinational project on folklore, heritage politics, and ethnic diversity. Klein has written extensively on oral narration, rituals, folk art, museum displays, and other forms of expressive culture in complex, multi-ethnic settings, primarily in the United States and Northern Europe. She has also worked on broad methodological issues and on the entangled disciplinary histories pertaining to folkloristics, ethnology, anthropology, museology, and all those other related fields. In addition to numerous articles and publications, she has been involved in producing on her own or editing or co-editing. I will just give you a sample of those. Legends and Folk Beliefs in a Swedish-American Community, a Study of Folklore and Acculturation, a co-edited volume on Swedish folk art, All Tradition is Changed, and I had the good fortune of working with her a bit on that project. She also produced From Experience to Text on Reflexivity in Cultural Sciences, The Street is Ours, Rituals in Public Places, that she also edited, Creating Diversities, Folklore, Religion, and the Politics of Heritage, that she also co-edited, and also Narrating, Doing, Experiencing Nordic Folkloristic Perspectives. And most recently, The Benefit of Broad Horizons, Intellectual and Institutional Preconditions for the Global Social Sciences. That was also a co-edited volume in 2010. She continues to be highly productive. Barbro Klein is a Fellow of the American Folklore Society, a member of the Royal Gustavus Adolphus Academy. In 2006, this Academy awarded her a major prize from the Jorgen Schlagen Fund, and in 2000 she received a Festschrift entitled Folklore, Heritage Politics, and Ethnic Diversity. Her AFS presidential invited address is entitled Reforming Women, Lilli Zickerman and Ottilia Adelborg, and the Swedish Folklife Studies. Please join me in welcoming our good colleague and friend, Barbro Klein.
Well, thanks very much, Kurt, and I'm so honored and pleased to be standing here tonight at the very end of this Nashville Congress. Reforming women. Kurt already mentioned, but I take the title again. Reforming Women, Lilli Zickerman, Ottilia Adelborg, and Swedish Folklife Studies. The years around 1900 vibrated with intellectual, artistic, and scholarly energies all around Europe. This was a time of remarkable social and cultural transformations: population increase, urbanization, industrialization, emigration. This was a formative period for new scholarly disciplines also, and among them folklore and folklife studies, ethnology, and related fields. This was also a time for reform movements, socialist, temperance, religious, and feminist movements. Middle-class men and women from the political right and the political left worked to bring about social, pedagogical, and cultural improvements. Indeed, and I like this is interesting, indeed different reform movements acted as catalysts for each other, and reformists were often involved in many causes. Today, I will take up one of the reform movements, the homecraft movement, or hemslöjdsrörelsen, in Sweden, which aimed to rescue disappearing traditional arts. I will speak about the movement primarily as it affected and was affected by two very different members of it, Lilli Zickerman and Ottilia Adelborg. In fact, the older I get, the more I'm interested in people's lives, in life's courses. There is so much unexpected and surprising behind the standard portraits, behind Wikipedia, for example. What was important to these women in their involvement with the homecraft movement? How do they depict their relationship to the country people whose arts and crafts they work to resuscitate? What are folklorists and ethnologists today to make of their efforts? And how does the movement actually intersect with academic disciplines such as folklore and ethnology? Of the many figures of thought and sets of ideas that were current around 1900, two were central to the homecraft movement. Many more were, but two were particularly central. First, there are ideas that had endured for more than 100 years after Herder published his works. And by the end of the 19th century, preservation movements had come to take it for granted that a country's unschooled rural inhabitants were in fact carriers of remnants of an ancient national culture. But the simple people were unaware of the treasures they harbored and therefore unable to protect themselves from the destructive onslaught of modernization and industrialization. Many educated people came to regard it as their given duty to assist the defenseless rural folk by collecting and reviving the arts and crafts that were about to be lost forever. Indeed, intervention from the educated was the only thing that could lead to a reconstitution of the genuine arts of a nation, as among others Dick Bauman and Charles Briggs point out in The Voices of Modernity. We recognize the ideas in numerous ways and in numerous scholarly and literary efforts during the 19th century, from the Grimm brothers to that of the founders of folklife museums and of such fields as ethnology and folklore. I mean, it's remarkable how powerful these ideas were. Other ideas that were more or less clearly articulated within the Swedish homecraft movement emanate from various arts movements in continental Europe. But perhaps even more influential were English thinkers and artists linked to the arts and crafts movement, such as John Ruskin, William Morris, and Walter Crane, who were interested in both the lesser arts and in economic rehabilitation, as Henry Glassy noted many years ago. Some of the thinking of the arts and crafts movement reached Swedish readers via the Norwegian art historian Lawrence Dietrichson, to whom beauty was a moral force and poor taste a symptom of social and moral decline. To him, Art, science, morality, and utility were conjoined as inevitably as beauty, truth, and goodness. But also Swedish thinkers such as Ellen Key came to influence the Swedish homecraft movement. Art is for all, said Kay, and in order not to become slaves to drudgery, all people must be taught to appreciate genuinely beautiful art. Now, it's hard for us. It's hard for us to really understand today how powerful and widespread these ideas were. Now, during the last few decades of the 19th century, many ideas regarding cultural preservation and rural improvements had already been put into practice in Sweden. Also, the influence from arts movements in continental Europe and England had several results. In 1874, for example, Sophie Lejonhufvud Adlersparre, if there ever was an aristocratic name, there it is. Sophie Lejonhufvud Adlersparre founded the Association of Friends of Textile Art, a Stockholm-based organization which produced textiles that were in part inspired by folk traditions. This is a picture from one of the exhibitions that the Friends mounted in Karlskrona in southern Sweden. Also, Artur Hazelius, a familiar name to many of you, Artur Hazelius, the founder of the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, and the founder of its open-air pendant, Skansen, collaborated, very clearly collaborated, very thoughtfully collaborated with social, economic, and aesthetic reformers. Together then, museums, artists, scholars in ethnology and adjacent fields, the homecraft movement, and the local history movement laid the foundation for a heritage canon of folk objects with a recognizably Swedish flavor. This collaboration was very much in evidence when a discipline of Nordic and comparative folklife studies was founded at the Nordic Museum. And this is one of the things I have been arguing many times. Now to Lilli Zickerman. She was just one of the many people engaged in these developments. Now, her father was a wealthy pharmacist in a southwestern Swedish town, and for a while she studied sewing and weaving. She even owned an embroidery shop in the town in which she grew up. In 1996, she studied at the South Kensington Museum, which was later the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And in 1897, she showed some of her work at the Stockholm exhibition. And at that very time, she also really fell in love with Swedish peasant textiles that were at the same time shown at the Nordic Museum. This was before the Nordic Museum moved into its big building. And she pondered over this, and she had for quite a while, it's clear, because already in 1899, she took the initiative to forming the Swedish Homecraft Association. Single-handedly, she gathered together an executive board which was chaired by the artist and prince, the brother of the king, Eugen. I mean, she went for the best. And the board also consisted of another artist, Ottilia Adelborg, about whom I will speak very soon. And there was Baroness Ebba Lam, and other very well-known Swedes on the board. And one issue was terminology, and it was finally decided to settle for the term hemslöjd or homecraft, and I'm using that very consciously here, and not words such as handicraft. Although Lilli Zickerman was really said to have been an insecure and rather shy person, she really comes forward as highly determined and highly accomplished. She was a skilled writer. She was prone to drastic expressions. She's said to have been an outstanding speaker, and her publications and printed speeches really make it possible to understand how she could have been as influential as she was. Over and over, she emphasized the E words that were essential to understanding homecraft: economics, ethics, aesthetics, education, and emigration. Luckily, these are E-words also in Swedish, so I'm not making anything up. Now, in different ways, economic issues have been and are incitements to the forming of crafts movements in different countries. In Sweden, at this time, poverty had worsened, and in part due to population increases. Many people were leaving the countryside. They were joining a swelling urban proletariat. And those who were able to emigrated, they emigrated primarily to the United States, and several intellectuals and politicians, particularly politicians on the right, they worried that the very best of Swedish stock was disappearing westwards. And like other reformers before her, Zickerman thought that Swedes were poor because they were lazy. And they were poor because they had really too little to do during the long, dark winters. So what she proposed was a grand program to relieve idleness and poverty. In her view, it was a matter of national concern and a moral duty for her and her associates to help poor people help themselves to find work and thereby to enhance the moral and aesthetic qualities of their lives. This meant that people had to be taught, it was a big program, they had to be taught to reject cheap, mass-produced goods. There's a fantastic Swedish word, so it's gottköpskram. And they had to learn to appreciate the quality and beauty of homemade wares. They had to learn to make traditional crafts from those few who still mastered them. And they were not merely to copy peasant furniture and textiles, they were to improve them. Stern control was needed, she said, to maintain high quality and proper styling. Ultimately, she hoped that people's love of their homes and their nation would be awakened and strengthened. And such love, she said, would prevent both emigration and the growth of a ruthless, un-Swedish proletariat. Oh my. Now, Zickerman and her associates worked with formidable energy to solve practical problems. As early as 1899, she opened the first shop in Stockholm, an outlet store for homecraft. Now, the next one, please. And there she is, to the left, and with her associates, and note the woman in the middle. She is a peasant woman from Dalarna, and this was very common at this time to include peasant women from Dalarna in all kinds of activities, even at the Nordic Museum. All the people who met you at the door were women from Dalarna. This one was called Kerstin Alm, I found out. Now, and then she worked hard to open other shops. I mean, they really can boom, 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 boom. This was in Mora, in Dalarna, and but we will not stay with all the shops. She also worked so hard to find skilled carpenters, weavers, lace makers, and shop managers who could produce wares and train and supervise others. All the people she hired had to learn. They had to learn to differentiate the good and the beautiful from the bad and the ugly. And she herself never doubted for a second, at least not in her written works, never doubted her ability to make the proper distinctions. Among the traditional artifacts she liked the best were some of these, 19th century carriage cushions from the south, from the 30s and the 1830s and 40s. Some were in Flemish weave, as this one, they're peasant work, and some were embroidered. I particularly like this one. I'm missing a pointer, but you can see how God looked after he had completed his work. He's resting to the right there. Take a look. But carriage cushions were one she also very much liked. I mean, she loved bobbin lace and was a grand collector of bobbin lace. Now, this one looks the way it does because it is made from a glass plate I just found. And she adored molded splint boxes from particularly central Sweden, and so on. But there were, of course, other objects as well she liked. But she was not alone in appreciating these particular forms. Artists such as Anders Zorn and Carl Larsson and Artur Hazelius, the museum builder, valued exactly the same kinds of forms and collected them and exhibited them. Indeed, all these people and others jointly developed a distinct Swedish aesthetic canon, and this canon is influential to this very day. But it is on the subject of the ugly, on ugliness and low quality, that Lilli Zickerman's writing comes truly alive. Like other crafts reformers, she detested modern dyes. I mean, some of us do too. She detested modern dyes as particularly noxious forms of industrial degeneration. They produced sharp and gaudy colors, the very opposite to the soft and beautiful nuances that were the hallmark of genuine traditional textiles. She also lashed out when women wasted time making useless luxuries, superfluous decorations, and false finery. I'm translating her exactly here. And a favorite target was crocheting. This was a very antithesis of the fine art of bobbin lace making. In a speech from 1901, she cites a conversation she had with young women in a village up north. In fact, she traveled all the time. But she asked these women what they did all evening. Well, we do nothing, they answered, she writes. But you can't do nothing all night long. Well, we crochet. And Zickerman writes, they couldn't have given a more truthful answer. People certainly crochet. In Sweden, in Norway, wherever you go, they crochet. There isn't a hovel, no matter how small and disorderly, that lacks a crocheted bedspread. Crocheting, she writes, is a truly weakening activity. One does not even have to sit up to do it. One can do it practically lying down. This is very important to her. Work into which no concentration and no bodily or spiritual power has been invested, that kind of work is reprehensible and has to be abolished. This was very important to her. Zickerman directed her outrage also at other targets. In 1904, she gave a speech at the opening of a homecraft store in Dalarna, in Leksand. It was actually together with a huge temperance movement meeting with young people. So she begins her speech by turning to the young people in the audience. She flatters their mothers and grandmothers, saying that it was in their work that the original taste of Dalarna came forward most clearly, with its fresh sense of color, its practical understanding of quality in weaving, its admirable sense of form. And then she continues, and I know, and you know it yourselves, that you have been about to follow that current of superficiality that characterizes our era. Yes, you have allowed yourselves to be tempted by the cheap finery with which the factories try to mislead you, to such an extent that you threw away, you sold, you even made rag rugs out of these sterling little pieces of art that you inherited. Yet she emphasizes, you did not give up altogether. Dalarna has remained one of the few regions in Sweden that gives hope for the future. Now, with regard to rag rugs, she shared a widespread opinion. Representatives of cultural, historical museums and craft schools did not look upon rag rugs as ways to be thrifty, but as destruction of valuable old materials. And rag rugs were not part of the aesthetic canon, and this despite the fact, yes please, and this, no, former ones. That one, yes. And this despite the fact that the homes were full of them. This is a painting made in 1913 by one of the so-called Folklife Painters. It was made in Leksand in Dalarna. And can you hear me when I'm without? Yeah, okay. The little girl on this painting is standing drinking coffee from a saucer. And of course, this was a time when youngsters were very much allowed to drink coffee. But I like that. And exactly oh, Marilyn, how nice. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Wow. You see? Now, the very same thing was true, of course, of quilts, patchwork quilts. I mean, they were reprehensible for a long, long time. And the Nordic Museum to this day has a really poor collection. Now, in 1914, Lilli Zickerman left the directorate of the Swedish Homecraft Association. She resigned from managing the homecraft shop there in Stockholm. She moved to Vittsjö in Skåne to join her brother, who was a furniture designer. And from this time on, she turned to completing a gigantic inventory of the traditional textiles of Sweden. In the course of her work, she took close to 25,000 black and white photographs, and she colored many of them by hand. Now, she didn't get a chance to publish it all, but she did other things too. In 1917, she commissioned the making of a now unique film, actually I stumbled upon it, which features folk artists at work. It was hard to get it here, so I'm going to show you some of the pictures made from glass plates from this film. And I mean, Zickerman traveled all around the country. She supervised every shot that was being taken. You can just go on, please. And she did not only concentrate on textiles, obviously. I love this one. Can you see? The double couple knitting, please. And of course, for some reason, the plates were much better when I hit the Bobbin lace makers, which was a long tradition in peasant life. I mean, as you can see in a lot of the folk costumes, Bobbin lace was extremely important. Please, the next one. And in fact, the Friends of Textile Arts was reviving Bobbin lace making. Yeah, speaking about pictures you get to love. Please go on. And here they are, the young people. They are doing this in the village of Mockfjärd in Dalarna. You can go on, please. One more. Yeah. Now, Zickerman was quite successful in many ways. The homecraft shops remained economically viable well into the 1970s. And she actually laid the foundation for a movement that continues to define and guard a distinct Swedish aesthetic profile. Now a few words about Ottilia Adelborg. And if a great deal has been written about Lilli Zickerman, especially within the homecraft movement, much less has been said about her role within the movement. What has been said has been about her role as an artist. Ottilia Adelborg was born in southern Sweden as the youngest daughter of a naval officer. Both her parents were socially very well connected. They came from aristocratic families. They didn't have much money. Her diaries are all about this. I mean, her background and the money, the lack of money. In 1865, Ottilia's father died, and 2 years later, her mother moved to relatives in Uppsala with her 3 daughters, Maria, Gertrude, and Ottilia. Although the 3 sisters were allowed to matriculate from secondary school, their further education was uncertain. And their mother does not appear to have been convinced that they needed advanced education, but nevertheless, they all turned into professional women. The eldest, well, she's there. The eldest to your left became a textile designer. The one to the very right, to my right, is Gertrude, became an important figure in the Swedish women's movement. All her life she fought, as a conservative, for women's right to vote and for women's right to higher education. And Gertrude was particularly concerned with the education of rural women. And for 20 years, she served as managing director of the offices of the Fredrika Bremer Society, a very important society advocating the rights of women. Don't forget, Sweden was extremely late in getting voting rights for women, 1921. Ottilia, on her part, she's the one in the middle, showing her profile. She always shows her profile. Showed artistic talent at very early age, but her mother was not keen about art school, and an aunt had to intervene, and eventually Ottilia Adelborg could attend the Royal Academy of Art. And among other students at the academy were Anders Zorn, and Karin Berge, who eventually married Carl Larsson. I mean, she studied with the very foremost painters at her time. She made her name for herself as illustrator of children's books, and eventually she also published books of her own. In 1892, for example, she brought out the flower alphabet of the Prince's Flower Alphabet. And you can see where the influence comes from. The next one, please. And a few years later, she published another kind of book, where the stylizations have a far more Swedish flavor. Please. And this is really known. This is a hallmark of her kind of work for a long, long time. The book was very early translated into English as Clean Peter and the Children of Grubby Lee. All right. But in this book, she really shows something. She has been called in several instances the creator of the Swedish picture book for children. But in those where she's in these art historical works, not a word about her involvement with the homecraft movement. But Ottilia also traveled extensively. She had no money, but somehow some relative or another always came forward with the appropriate amount. She spent many trips to continental Europe. At one point in 1901, she spent at least 3 months in Italy, filling pages with sketches of architectural details and writing in her diary how she was picking up works by Ruskin, among other, the 3rd volume of the Stones of Venice. And she never in her diary, though, reveals what aspects of Ruskin's work she really liked. And from her later work, it could be surmised that she was inspired by his thoughts on the social value of art and the artist's role in working together with others. After she returned to Stockholm, she became her mother's daughter, and she was involved with countless social visits back and forth. But her mother also got very ill, and increasingly she's burdened by this. In 1903, her mother dies, and Ottilia writes in her diary. Listen to this. My heart is full of gratitude. My grief almost gives way to my gratitude. Mother is no longer in pain. And then there's and I have my freedom. And there is an exclamation mark. Will I be able to use it constructively? I have my freedom and my own time, and I can become an artist once again. Exclamation mark. These lines are said to have shocked one reader of her diary. But Ottilia, who is now 48 years old, she lost no time in acting on her freedom. After a trip to Holland in the spring of 1903, she rented a summer home in Gagnef in Dalarna for herself and her sisters. And, well, Marilyn, how did I'm goofing, yeah. Gagnef is right there. She had visited Gagnef before, and she wrote in her diary, and I found that all is naive in Gagnef. There is a fairy tale style everywhere. The place was magical to her, and she communicated some of that magic in some of her works. Please. Now this one she did actually not in Gagnef but in Orsa. One other, please. So when the summer holidays were over, her sisters returned to Stockholm, but Ottilia stayed. She stayed in Gagnef, and from now on she decided Gagnef was her home. And after some time, her sisters joined her, but she lived alone for a while. Please. This was actually taken by a local photographer, Hans Per Persson, in 1905. Next one, please. Yep, she's good at showing her hiding herself in some way or another. But very soon after she settled in Gagnef, her sisters joined her. And in 1908, they all moved in to a new house for themselves, in part thanks to a great honor that her sister Gertrude received. But Ottilia sought calm and solitude, but it is not certain that she had found it in Gagnef. Her diary from Gagnef is full of descriptions of a social life as intensive as that in Stockholm. Her door was always open, so local people came in all the time, and a stream of notables were guests in her house. And she also was a guest in many others' houses. Many of them were a network of intellectuals and artists who, like her, had made Dalarna their home. And many of them were at the forefront of the debates of their era. They were involved in numerous reform movements, and these things were always discussed in the various social occasions. And there they were, Anders Zorn and his wife Emma Zorn, the Carl Larssons, and the court physician Axel Munthe, Selma Lagerlöf, the Nobel laureate, and so on and on. But nevertheless, or perhaps this was before, despite all the intense social life, Ottilia soon, or very soon, after she came to Gagnef, started rekindling her interest in preserving handicrafts and also in the homecraft movement. The local art tradition that fascinated her the most was bobbin lace. Bobbin lace making, and which has a particularly long history in several parishes in Dalarna, where we find names that are very much like the quilt names in the United States, such as the Devil's Lunchbox or the Spider. Oh, please, oh, you have them again. I can't resist them. And like Zickerman, Ottilia Adelborg deplored the habit of cutting up old pieces of lace and using them in rag rugs. And as soon as she could, just a few weeks after settling in Gagnef, she started a school in the making of bobbin lace. And she obviously got together all the young girls in Gagnef for the task. This was in her first temporary home in Gagnef. They were to learn, and fast it would have to happen. And she found a teacher in this nearby Mockfjärd, where the Friends of Textile Art had been working for some years. She continued this school for many years, and she herself eventually became an accomplished lace maker. She also, this was part of her artwork. One more, please. And one more. And these are some of her lace designs. And way into at least 1915, 1920, she worked with the young girls, and here you have her with her pupils. Oh, and hidden behind a huge hat this time. This picture is also taken by Hans Per Persson. As time went on, Ottilia became interested in revitalizing also other art forms. She was driven, just like Lilli Zickerman, by a burning desire to prevent these forms from being lost. But by the same token, she could look at her engagement in the homecraft movement with some distance. And she often depicts both the homecraft ideology and her own involvement in it with humor and quite some reflection. In the last of the 3 books of essays and drawings that she published while in Dalarna, she includes a brief, seemingly very artless essay which is entitled Homecraft, hemslöjden. And she begins there by noting the small talk that often goes on between model and artist, and how this talk by itself probably turned to homecraft. And she describes how the woman she was drawing seemed quite attentive, and how she herself became more and more involved in the subject of homecraft, and how she ended up with a resounding, I'm quoting her here, she ended up with a resounding speech about dyeing crafts, destructive industrial dyes, the need to improve sheep breeding. And the upshot was, she notes, that I told this woman that it was her unquestionable duty to revitalize all this disappearing knowledge. But after a while, the woman lost her patience and spoke up. Now, did I really think that she had time for homecraft and that sort of thing? Didn't she have enough work to do as it was? Didn't she have to spin and weave cloth for the men and the children? And didn't she have to weave sheets and tablecloths? I mean, she's quoting the woman here in the third voice. Blankets and rugs. Didn't she have enough to do without bothering with homecraft and vegetable dyes and other novelties? These kinds of things were for people who had nothing better to do. Says this woman, says Ottilia, there are many aspects to this quote. I won't be able to go into it. But in this essay, and in all the 3 books for adults that Ottilia published while living in Gagnef, she demonstrates that she has ability to understand how the people she portrayed reasoned and how they reacted to her. She came to realize that to them, the ideas of the homecraft movement could be both incomprehensible and useless. And although she keeps her distance, she nevertheless depicts respectful meetings between human beings, not relationships between aristocrat and folk, or between educator and pupils. She wants to understand. She may not be able to, but she wants to understand the people among she lives. But as an artist, and this I think is very important here, as an artist, she also wishes to preserve their naive and fairy tale style qualities. This is a storyteller. It's an illustration to a wonderful essay. Now, her three late books for adults stand out in their portrayals of children. The children we meet in these works differ profoundly from those in her early children's books and in her Crane and stylized and her Swedish stylizations. In her 3 late books, the children are sometimes the one before, please. You miss. I love this one. They are sometimes quite happy, but and then the next one. But often, very often, their faces are sad or distant. This is Sågar's Carolina in Orsa. Often the children look withdrawn or overwhelmed by the presence of mothers and other adults who are often drawn too long or oversized. And in her art, Ottilia Adelborg catches something important about the vulnerability of children and women. Her late drawings and watercolors are not stylized depictions of folk life. These people are not mannequins wearing folk costumes, as was usually the case in the so-called Folklife paintings. Adelborg comes close to her subjects, and she touches nerves. Now, of all her work, one appears to have become particularly significant to Ottilia Adelborg, and eventually also to the people of Gagnef, namely the so-called memory house, Minnesstugan, which, like Artur Hazelius' Skansen, or Zorn's museum creation, the old farm in Mora, and a host of other open-air museums. It consists of several buildings. Yeah, it's just one sketch from one of them. And Minnestugan opened in 1909. She herself walked there often. She writes about it all the time. It was a place where she sought solitude and reflection. But her sisters were, the previous one, please. Yeah. They were all involved in Minnestugan. Here they are portrayed outside of it. The textile designer, the feminist, and Ottilia. Yeah. Now a few conclusions. It's instructive, I think, to place side by side the life histories of two contemporaries who, despite striking individual differences, shared ways to meet the demands and opportunities of the cultural and historical moment in which they lived. What then was important to these two women in their involvement with the homecraft movement? What impression do they give us of their relationship to the people whose crafts they work to resuscitate? How can folklorists and ethnologists think about them today? Well, I hope I have at least tried to respond to some of these questions, but not all of it. So let me say a few more words. Lilli Zickerman and Ottilia Adelborg were certainly both preoccupied with a sense of imminent cultural loss and a sense that industrialization was about to destroy all the most beautiful manifestations of Sweden's traditional rural culture. They were both convinced of the need to energize common people and to help common people to rescue the very best of their inherited arts and craft skills. Moreover, they were both obviously convinced that they possessed the ability to inspire others. But while maintaining social distance, they always did, they both approached common people with respect, even though Zickerman's rhetoric sometimes gives us a different impression. But Adelborg went much further than that. She realized than mere, if it's so mere, I don't know, but mere respect. Ottilia Adelborg realized that people were not always enthusiastic about resuscitating old things and old techniques, which to them meant nothing but hard work. In her nuanced and sensitive portraits, particularly of children, Adelborg, the artist, also reveals insights into people's inner selves, insights of a kind that many an ethnographer today tries to get to. Perhaps she is able to do so because of her wish to preserve their fairy tale style qualities. I don't know. But in any case, it seems that in exoticizing people, she gives them inner depth. Today, opinions differ a great deal about Lilli Zickerman and Ottilia Adelborg, among those who have opinions at all. On the one hand, Zickerman, Adelborg, and their friends and colleagues in the homecraft movement cause admiration and applause. And not surprisingly, this is so within the modern homecraft movement itself, in which especially Zickerman's pioneering contributions are repeatedly hailed as foundational. I would also like to emphasize that, like other women in their circles, Zickerman and Adelborg stood in the very crossroads of ideas which they themselves did not always articulate and could not always grasp, but ideas that affected them strongly anyway. This is particularly true when it comes to women's issues and women's rights, issues which were constantly discussed in the circles in which they moved, and of course via Ottilia's sister. Both Lilli Zickerman and Adelborg and Ottilia Adelborg were among the many aristocratic and middle-class women who at this time were stepping out into public life in new ways. I'm referring you to a very fine work by a Swedish historian, Eva Österberg, on this score. And it was their engagement in the homecraft movement, in particular their interest in textiles, that made this step particularly possible. And I find it intriguing indeed to reflect on the extent to which women's movements in Sweden and elsewhere are linked to textiles and work with textiles. But, and now I'm finally coming to the other hand, what about folklorists, folklife scholars, and ethnologists today? What about people in our own disciplines? And here opinions are divided. Here the reactions to these women differ a great deal, if they know about them at all. Many students of culture in our time, as you know, this is certainly true in Sweden, not least ethnologists and others, who are fearful of exoticizing and essentializing other people, they have no idea of what to make of a Zickerman or an Adelborg. And in the history of our, all the artists and reformers and all the others who hover in the background of the history of our field have for decades been described in various ways as moralistic interventionists, as self-appointed experts who think they know local traditions better than locals themselves. And at best, the artists and the reformers stand out as helpmates to the university-trained folklorists and ethnologists. And of course, it is not easy to disregard the colonialism and the class-marked efforts of a Zickerman and an Adelborg. And even if a great deal of the critique that has been going on in our field has been highly necessary, one cannot dismiss and ignore the actual accomplishments and contributions of the reformers and the artists and the intellectuals. Even today, uneasy ethnologists would have to ask themselves, where would we be in our time without a Zickerman and an Adelborg and the others in similar movements? Certainly, Swedish culture would be much poorer without their work to rescue textiles, textile techniques, and other forms of material culture from the peasant past. Indeed, it would be necessary to ask if a field of ethnology would have developed at all without the artifacts they and their friends and colleagues collected and preserved, without the craft skills they saved from oblivion, without their sketches and photographs and films, and without the museum awareness they helped establishing in smaller communities as well as nationally. There is a bit more. I apologize for taking up a lot of time here, but there is a little bit more. If the women of the homecraft movement are the subject of an appreciative history within the movement itself and within museums, they remain written out of the histories of folklife studies. At least this is true in all Northern European countries. And this is particularly striking since it was women of the homecraft movement, the women who succeeded Zickerman and Adelborg, who took care of the textiles and folk costumes that were amassed by Artur Hazelius and others. But they didn't only do that, they also studied these textiles. In fact, one woman called Emily von Balterstorff wrote books of dissertation size, and I dare say dissertation quality, in the 1920s about the kinds of textiles that were collected by Zickerman and Adelborg. Yet the early contributors, these are the early contributors to our fields that we learn about in the histories of ethnology, at least in Sweden. That's Artur Hazelius and the holders of the professorships in folklife studies, among them the great Sigurd Eriksson. The women are totally left out until the 1950s. So what's new, I hear you say. Right. Well, my answer is, well, nothing is new, except that we need to study again and again the beginnings of our field. We need to investigate the close ties of our field to various reformist and artistic and intellectual debates including 19th century feminism. And if we do so, we are bound to find out many things about us, about the rich intellectual roots of folklore and ethnology. Thank you. Of course, if people want to post them at this late hour.
Barbro's agreed to take a question or two, if there are any.
Bit late. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself, yes, and
Yeah.
state your stand.
I'm just wondering how the last woman that you talked about published those books. What was the process of publishing at that time?
I can't hear you. Would you please? I'm sorry. Yeah.
How did she publish the books that she published? And was it easy for her to do so? Were they self-published? And what was it like for a woman to publish books that were...
You're talking about Emily von Walterstorff. Yeah, this is a good question. Now, she was actually supported by a very rather big group of women at the Nordic Museum. Now, they were sort of not talked about that much, but she managed to get it into the museum series. But she has never, but that doesn't mean that she's mentioned in the histories of the field at all. But she did publish it. Yes, thank you, Deborah.
Hi, I'm Carol Silverman. I was really interested in the nuanced history you presented in the light of what seems to be the absence of men. And I was wondering if you could maybe read through the literature on resistance in this case and what it might add, or actually maybe it tells us more about what the literature on resistance doesn't do for us and what you've done for us. Because it seems to me like some of the classic articles on reading resistance in terms of gender talk about, like Sherry Ortner's article, the absence of thick description. Now, you've certainly done that. But also she points to the kind of collaboration part of resistance, how resistance is always paired with collaboration with norms of the time. And you've done that very well, but I wonder if you could talk about the lives these women led, extremely independent, aside from what they were doing, but how they led their lives and how that might understand their art projects as well.
Now, Carol, you did ask about particularly the collaboration with men. Yeah, and this is really interesting. I mean, who knows what kind of lives they were leading in terms of relationships to men. There is not a mention, for example, in these diaries. They wouldn't mention it, of course. But Lilli Zickerman collaborated very closely with several men. On a professional side, among others, with a very well-known artist called Gustav Anka Krona. And in fact, he was quite instrumental in the kind of work she did in the homecraft movement. So there were those kinds of collaborations, but not in the case, as far as I could see. I really looked for it in the case of these three sisters. It's really remarkable. On the other hand, in the various the reform associations that especially the sister Gertrude belonged to, there were many men, and there were lots and lots of associations, little clubs and that sort of thing, and every one of them had a man as at the top. In fact, they wrote about it themselves, that they couldn't really do it unless they had a man as a president or as chair or whatever they were called. But this is really an important question too.